Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this question and answer session that is accompanying the tutorial on four in hand. My name is Margaret Merkley, and I'm chair of the program committee and president of the Ontario Guild of English Handbell Ringers.
Hello, I'm Manny Sun, and I am joining Marg today as a co-moderator for today's handbell tutorial. I am a member of the Cobourg Communications Committee, and as the email coordinator, I am in contact with our membership on a weekly basis.
Today's tutorial, four in hand, was presented by Debbie Fingas. In addition to this tutorial, Debbie has created one already on demystifying meters, and it is now uploaded onto the Cobourg website. If you missed it, you can go back and watch it. And she has a third tutorial in store for us on chimes, and that is on Saturday, May the 1st, and we hope that you'll be able to join us at that time as well. Thank you very much, Debbie, for sharing your time and your expertise with us.
Debbie is the Minister of Music at Trinity United Church in Cobourg, where she accompanies weekly services and conducts two children's choirs, the Chancel Choir and the Jubilate Handbell Choir. In addition to her church work, Debbie enjoys being involved with local community music groups, including the Associate Director of La Jeunesse Choirs. Debbie is also the chair-elect of the newly formed Handbell Musicians of Canada. So at this point, we will be happy to be taking your questions submitted via the Zoom text chat.
I'll jump right in, Debbie. One thing about four in hand is that it is, I believe, something that is a very challenging technique. Are there tricks about developing a comfort level in picking it up?
I really think that it's just the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so you take the opportunity to ring four in hand. So I know when I was learning, I went to a festival and I took two positions, and I rang those two positions the entire time on really, like we registered as tin ringers, and we rang four in hand the whole time to try and get good at it. And so after a week of or 5 days, I guess it was, of ringing all day, every day in those positions, you kind of get better at it and trying to figure out figure things out and when to pick up things and put things down, and what works and what doesn't for damping and all of that kind of thing. So the more you can do it, the better. I would say don't start slow, just jump right in.
So Debbie, how long had you been ringing handbells before you started trying your hand at four in hand?
Well, I started ringing as I was a mandatory course as part of my Master of Arts in Church Music in Columbus, Ohio. So I guess it would have been around 2008, something like that. So I did handbells, introduction and advanced handbells. So there was 2 1-week intensive courses. But we didn't get handbells at our church until 2010. It's our 10th anniversary of having bells at our church. And we bought them because I knew how to ring them, and I wanted to get my congregation ringing them. Right. But I wanted to keep ahead of my ringers. So in order to keep ahead of my ringers, I did a lot of ringing. So my friend and I, we traveled to the States for festivals together, and pretty much yearly. And I also travel with my handbell choir as well. Lots of workshops, lots of anything I could do to educate myself in handbells. Yeah.
Right. So it was kind of something that you took initiative in.
Absolutely. I fell in love with bells from the courses that I took. And right. I think, and I know my congregation did too. And we have a very active handbell program at the church now. And it's just something I really love.
I want to go back to something from the first question that I asked about. Your answer was the intensity, like you just have to get in there and practice and practice and practice. And you said that you practiced and played for 5 days. Now, that's hard on the wrists and the hands. So do you have any tricks or techniques about your hands hurting less? Like after that length of time,
don't find it hard on my wrists, and I don't know if that's just a proper technique thing or whether I just have super strong wrists or something. I don't know, but I definitely, between your fingers can get kind of sore, especially if you're ringing forehand handing bigger bells. So, but you can double up your pairs of gloves, right? Wear 2 pairs or get the thicker ones that have the padding, or if I haven't actually got a lot of experience in this, and Mandy, I don't know if you do, but you can, if you're not traveling forehand, if you're not switching over for accidentals, you could lock your handles together, and that makes your the profile lower for the amount that you're picking up. Do you have experience with that, Mandy?
There's a member of one of my choirs who plays exclusively Leland, and I personally find it well, I've tried it, but not really liked it because it limits me, or at least I'm not as proficient with it. So it limits how quickly I can take a cluster apart.
Yeah.
And it also means that if I have something set up Leland, my neighbor isn't able to take a bell out of that cluster quickly. So it ends up being logistically a bit more extra work to do to manage a Leland. But obviously, if you have small hands, locking the handles definitely gives you a better grip on everything. So I would say, and yes, as you were mentioning, if you're ringing a bigger bell forehand, then Leland is a possibility. And speaking from my own experience, when I first started learning forehand, I found that I was really anxious. And so I just had the death grip, right? It's like the grip of death. You
don't want to let go.
Exactly, right? You're holding it tightly, even though you're not, for instance, you're up in the treble and, it's the introduction. There's 20 bars worth of just the battery, playing out that first statement of the melody. Meanwhile, you're standing in the treble clutching these bells in a death grip and you haven't even played a note and already your hands are starting to ache. So my advice for anyone who's starting out learning forehand is just to relax. Just relax
not
your grip.
To play them you don't have to hold them if you're not playing them.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
if you're just shellying up or doubling up in forehand, if you're not ringing those upper 7s for a while, put them down. Right? Yeah. You don't have to hold on to them the entire time, right? Put them back on the foam. I saw a question pop out about how to set that up. As I say, I don't actually ring this way, so I'm not an expert. But when I was talking about locking the handles, I have 2 bells here. These are the only 2 bells I have in my house right now. They're a little big, but anyway, I was talking about you actually insert the handle into the other handle, like you would kind of for stringing up on a bell tree. That's what I mean by locking the handles, which is why it's hard to get them apart, because you can't just drop it on the foam, right? You actually have to unassemble your bells. So yeah, I know there's video tutorials elsewhere on doing some of those alternate forehand techniques. And I'm not probably the one to teach you how to do that, but that's what we're kind of talking about.
So can we go back just to a term that you used, and that may be what locking is? Leland.
Yeah, Leland. That's the Leland style of forehand.
It's just, the name for it.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you go to Google, you'll find.
If you Google it.
Yeah, so we have a question here from Rob. He's asking about how you would set up your forehand clusters. Do you always set up in a particular order? Do you always put the lower bells as your primary? And what factors would come into play if you decided for a different arrangement?
Okay, so when I started, so it's really a look at your piece and figure it out. But when I started, my kind of go-to preference would be, let's say I'm ringing, I would put my bigger bells as my primary, so the ones I'm holding on to, because they're bigger, and then my secondary would probably be the smaller 2. So if I was ringing G, A, B, C, I'd hold on to G and A, and then I'd have B and C as my secondary. If I was ringing doubling up, right, I'd have my 6s, and then my 7s would be secondary. And partly because I want to be able to put them down easily. But sometimes you don't want to do it that way. So, for example, let's say you were ringing G, A, B, C, and you had a little bit that went B, C, B, C, B, C, B, C, and you'd be like, ding, 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 ding. That's kind of silly. So then you might want to set up with G, Yeah. Anyway, you might want to set up differently so that
Yeah.
you're ringing alternately instead of just in one hand, whatever the two notes are, right?
Yeah. So you would maybe set up the G in your primary and the C in your primary, and then flip the handles in, and grab your A and B as your secondaries.
Right. So you have to look at your patterns and what's going to make it easier for you. Yeah. Also, accidentals. If you need to be able to switch your F to your F sharp and back and forth, then you want to make sure that one is your secondary so you can get it out of your hand easily, as opposed to having to put down your entire cluster and then like pick it up. So that your accidentals are really important too. Mm-hmm. So those are sorts of things when you're looking at your music, you're going to be looking for and making your adjustments. And then you'd write on your score, like you write the, I don't know if I had it in there, but you write the letter name and then your slash and then which one's your secondary, so that you write down what your setup is actually on your music. And then if you need to switch it later, you can do so. But it is kind of a bit of choreography figuring it all out. When you first get your piece.
Yeah. And the other thing too is don't be afraid to change your setup. I know that if you're starting out four in hand, you want to be consistent. So as Debbie was suggesting, you would probably start with the G and the A as well. In the example where you're playing the G to C, you would start with the bigger bells, G and A, in opposite hands, and then pick up the B and C, the smaller bells, as your secondaries. And you would probably start out that way until you get a feel for it. Yeah. But then over time, as you start encountering passages where, as Debbie was suggesting, you have to ring, you have to constantly be ringing like a B and a C, and you have to like flip back and forth between primary and secondary over and over, that just becomes impractical. And at which point you could consider changing up your layout so that you're switching the hands in which your bells are split. So don't forget that you can actually, because your clusters aren't set up for the entire piece, you don't have to stay with the same setup. If there's a particular setup that works best for the beginning of the piece and another setup that works better for the second part of the piece, don't be afraid to switch it up. If once you're comfortable with four in hand and you're able to track which bell is in which hand, you are free to just change your setup as you go along. As long as Debbie says, you make the markings on your music so that you remember where the clusters should be and which notes are in which hand.
Do the same thing every time.
Yeah, exactly. Be consistent. And personally, I find that my usual default, if I'm ringing the G to C position, my default is to split use the G and C as my primaries. And then the B natural is with the G and the A natural is with the C. And so often if you're ringing in C major, this works really well because you're ringing the G and the C are often ringing together. And then the G and the B are also ringing together often, which is actually kind of nice. But then it also means that if you flip to C minor,
you can get rid of that B.
You get rid of that. You can get rid of the naturals and switch in the flats.
A flat.
Yeah. Which is really, really easy because you almost never have to pick up a G flat.
Right.
Or a C flat.
That's right.
Obviously, it depends on the piece. If you have to swap it up,
it's really important to have a flexible mindset from the sounds of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Debbie, we have a question in the chat that I think is probably a pretty common one about asking sort of how low a bell can you use for four in hand? How common is four in hand in the bass bells, say from C5 to C4? Is it ever used?
I mean, I think there are some people who do that, but I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's probably not ergonomically, healthy for most people. I'm not going to say that nobody does that. If you're picking up a bell as an accidental, like let's say you don't have time to weave it and you're just picking it up and ringing it once and putting it back down and you're using the four in hand technique to do that, go right ahead. But if you're like, I wouldn't stand there holding C, D, E, F, 4, for an entire piece. I think it's probably a really bad idea. There are the four in hand quartets. They don't go usually below a C5, I think.
C4, it depends. You might have a couple bells down there.
But I wouldn't stand like that for the entire piece for normally.
Yeah, I think it also depends on personal, like if you've got bare hands, hands like a bear,
Yeah.
giant bear paws, you might be able to get away with ringing a C4 the way you would ring a C6, right? Depending on your own physicality, right? But for most people, as Debbie said, a C4 is not something you want to be four-in-handing consistently. I have had to do this in that particular position, had to ring C4 up to F4, actually even G4. So that's the C in the second space of the bass clef. That's that C. So I've had to ring a series of notes in that area, and then was forced to play four in hand. And it was possible, but not comfortable. And it definitely wasn't something where I was holding on to clusters the entire time. I was taking every opportunity I could to put the secondary bells down. And it was kind of, I would play four in hand if I had to, but if I could weave or rearrange my bells or do something else, I much preferred playing single bells as opposed to, as an act of desperation, picking up four in hand.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I know that, like my daughter was saying, that she was assigned at school when she was, in grade 7 or 8, she was assigned, sort of like D and E5, D, E, F, G or something. And she found them way too big, right? At, as a 12-year-old or whatever, just way too much for her. So yeah, if you're assigning bells, just take your ringers, in mind and who they are and what they can, and how long your rehearsals are and all that kind of stuff too. But yeah, it's better not to get hurt.
I just had another question, Debbie, in terms of you've talked about your markings a little bit when you're trying to mark your score. Do you have any other ideas about how people should mark their score to let them know what's happening in terms of picking up and putting down? And
well, I think the standard answer to that is putting down a bell. You write like a little X after the note, not before the note, because that's a double sharp. But after the note, you put down like a little X, and then that's like put it down, right? And then as opposed to like an arrow, which you could confuse with an echo or something, right? So I think that that's pretty common for putting things down. But I mean, in terms of like your setup, the double slash is between the primary and secondary would be shelley, and the single slash is four in hand. And then you just write them like you would, right? So just like this, if that makes sense. So your slashes with your little with your letters below and above, and then that'll help you. That'll help you remember. And then if you have to change your setup, you just write what you're changing.
Right. Debbie, do you use the single slash for four in hand versus the double slash for shelley? Okay. Yeah, that's pretty consistent as well.
I think that that's sort of standard in terms of what people. Now, of course, people have their own stuff, and that's fine. But I mean, if somebody else picked up your music, if you've done something that's kind of conventional, it's kind of nice for them to already, if you've already figured out what needs to be, like how the setup works.
And it's also nice to sometimes I see markings in music where people are writing novels to themselves. It's like drop the B flat, pick up B natural, four in hand for next bar.
My ringers will do that, and it's useless because you can't read it that fast.
Yeah, by the time you've finished reading it, the bar that you needed to be natural in is gone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So if you can use compact notation, like the slash notation, it's really, it makes it a lot simpler to just to visually grab that and digest it in time so that you can actually prepare your clusters in advance.
Mm-hmm.
We have a comment in the chat box that just reminds everybody to do things in pencil so that somebody can change as needed.
Yes, do it in pencil. And you know what else I bought recently for my ringers is we have erasable highlighters. And they erase really nicely. They really do. They have like, I wonder if I don't see them in the room with, here they are. They're on my desk. They look like this. I got them at Staples. and they have like a highlighter tip, and then the other end, it looks like hard plastic, but it's actually an eraser, and it erases really nicely on the music. It totally disappears. So if you have somebody who needs to do things in color, these exist, and I bought these for my ringers.
They're Friction brand, and I have
Yes,
pens like that. Yeah, I have pens and highlighters like that. And I actually heard about them from my mother-in-law because she quilts. And so she has the same style of pen where she makes markings on fabric, and when you iron it, it disappears. And it's the same idea. It's like a heat, when you treat it with heat, it disappears. So in theory, I guess you could take your sheet music, put it in a low oven, and or iron it. Either iron it to flatten or put it in a low oven, and all the markings would disappear. But I think if you put it in the freezer, the markings reappear. So
is that right?
Oh. Yeah, I don't think it's not good for writing spy messages to try and get each other secrets. But I think it would be definitely something you would want to consider for highlighting music if you must.
Yeah, if you must use color, and so I do have. I bought those and I keep them in the bell room.
Debbie, I know that you are a handbell director, and often in a choir, if you have enough members, then you don't have to play four in hand. No one needs to play four in hand. So what do you do with sort of this really keen musician who joins your choir and they are really interested, and to keep them engaged, you're like, hey, maybe four in hand is a thing. At that point, how do you give a musician like that the opportunity to play four in hand if your choir doesn't allow it?
I mean, I haven't really had that problem. I'm not sure. But I mean, because we have sevens, we're a 4.5 octave choir. So we have all the way up to C8. So, and I don't think I've ever had more than 13 ringers. So, or 12 ringers. Anyway, so, yeah, I haven't really had that problem. We have, if you find a part that has extra like chime work or that kind of thing, there might be some opportunity there, especially if some of the other ringers, I guess, are weaker, right, and are having trouble with their accidentals, and you just need to take them down to 2 bells, and then you could put them on a position beside them so they're kind of helping their neighbor with their accidental and bringing their own 2. That would give them an opportunity to 4 in hand. I'm brainstorming.
Or if you had like a second set of bells, you could actually
we do have access to a second set of bells, which is a luxury because one of my ringers has her own. Yes, so we can double up, and if there was part like that, yeah.
If you had a really enthusiastic whippersnapper who joined your choir and was just soaking it all up, and you wanted to challenge them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well, we move around positions, so any of that would be possible.
And so actually you mentioned chimes. Do you ever run into situations where you need to shelley a chime?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so in that situation, so say you're playing like a C6 D6 and you also need to play a C6 D6 chime shelley. Which would you pick up, the chime as your primary or the bell as your primary?
Probably, I mean, if I was already holding the bells, then I just keep them as primary. I think that would be easier anyway than holding the chimes. I think it'd be easier to hold onto a bell and have chimes as secondary. But if I was already holding the chimes and I needed to pick up the bells, I'd do it the other way around. I don't think that there's a real preference. Without picking them up in my hands, it's hard to know.
Yeah, I think it would depend on context.
I think it depends on context, yeah. But certainly, I don't know, level 2+, level 3 music, you can get into those situations, right?
And that actually takes me to another question, actually, that I should have thought of earlier. When you're playing a passage, do you necessarily set up, if you're doubling, so you're playing C6, D6, and say, maybe E6, F6, and you've got the double, the 7s, do you necessarily play them shelley? even if you're octave doubling? What, do you have
Um,
a personal preference? Is your preference to play octave doubles four in hand or shelley?
yeah. So if I never have to play them individually in the section, then I prefer shelley because they always ring and they're nice and strong. But if I were going to have, like, if in the middle there, I've got an E6 by itself, it's not worth it. I just pick them up four in hand and then you can bring them and bring them together, right? So, again, it depends on the passage. But if it's a passage where it's just purely doubling, I like shelley. It's nice and consistent.
Okay.
And I think I like it better from my ringers. It's easier for them to do than getting the two four in hand together if they're not really experienced.
Right.
But if they're going to have to ring single notes in the middle of that, obviously not.
Right.
So yeah, it
Yeah.
just depends on the passage.
Yeah.
So I guess probably personally, when I've been ringing, I don't use shelley very much. It doesn't happen very often that you just have like a page of just doubles.
Straight doubles, yeah. I'm like you, Debbie, that I started out being more comfortable with the shelleys just because it was consistent and it was easy and you could just ring, right? But as you get more comfortable with the four in hand, I found that setting my bells up four in hand, even for an octave double, it gives you more control over the individual bell. So
Right.
if I wanted more six of the lower primary
Mhm.
bell, you can angle your hand so that you actually get more of your primary than of the secondary. So I personally usually default to four in hand, unless, as you were saying, you're in a passage where it's just, you have the added octave over the melody line and you're just blasting anyways.
That's what I was gonna say. It's a double forte, like, and then it's just like, I just want the strength from the shelley then. But if it's like, or as I say, because I'm usually directing, not ringing, if I'm being honest, right? So then for my ringers, I'll be like, okay, you can shelley this just because I want to make sure it's there. But if they're gonna have to do singles, it's not worth like putting it down and picking it up or like trying to turn it in your hand, or it's not any of that ridiculousness. So yeah, no, it's
So, Debbie, we're so lucky that you're able to give us the perspective both from a director and from a ringer as well.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but doesn't every director really have to ring? I mean, if you get someone missing from your group that week, you have to fill in. I mean, like you're standing in front of them with, two people aren't here this week, and I've got those bells.
Or there's an opportunity now for your whippersnapper enthusiasts to play that set of bells that's next to them and try to play it four in hand on the fly.
Absolutely, if they have some idea what to do. But yeah, no, they filling in and helping if there's somebody who's really keen, and because there's often people missing, right? Mm-hmm. Or looking at church choir, it's it's not that they're not, especially this year, with you're got a runny nose, you're staying home. Right.
So I'm right. I think we've had a great session for your question and answer part of the tutorial. Before we go, I just would like to remind everybody, if you can tune in next week, we have the tutorial by Lisa Kirikides on finding the melody in your score. So thank you for both to Debbie in particular for producing and for hosting the Q&A session, and for those of you who watched and participated. Thank you, and stay safe.